You wake up on a bed of straw. It's moist, because of course it is. The thatch roof above you is doing that charming little thing where it pretends to be a roof, but is really just an accessory for rain. You're wearing wool. Not the nice, soft kind. No, this is the scratchy, I lost a bet with a sheep kind of wool. Outside, it's thundering. Loudly. The sky is having a dramatic emotional breakdown again. And you, poor, innocent, 14th century you, are deeply, sincerely convinced that the sky is mad at you. Why? Because God is mad at you. Or a saint. Or the devil. Or the elf that lives behind the oven. The medieval explanation for thunder wasn't climate science, it was moral science. You've sinned. Or your neighbor has sinned. Or some random Miller 7 towns over has fornicated with the wrong person, and now the heavens are screaming. Either way, your best hope is to pray, confess, or just accept that your crops are about to drown. Your world is loud, wet, superstitious, and confusing, and it's about to get wetter. So before you tuck that straw blanket closer and nod off into the sweet abyss of medieval misinformation, go ahead and gently like the video and subscribe. Not because I said so, but because your 3 a.m. brain needs more of this exact kind of soothing chaos. And I'd love to know, what time is it for you right now, and where in the world are you drifting off from? Drop it in the comments. It's oddly comforting seeing sleepy humans from all over. All right, let's go back to the storm. You're lying there, listening to the thunder rumble across the sky like an angry drunk rolling furniture above your ceiling. The wind whistles through the holes in your wall, because insulation isn't a thing. The rain drips through the ceiling, because gutters haven't been invented yet. The floor is dirt, because medieval interior design was basically earth, but inside. But you're not scared because you're wet. You're scared because thunder means judgment. In the Middle Ages, natural phenomena weren't just weather, they were divine feedback. Every lightning bolt was a Yelp review from God. You didn't check the weather app before you left for the fields. You checked your conscience. Rain wasn't just inconvenient. It was theological. People believed that God used weather to communicate his approval or disapproval. Which is adorable, really, assuming your crops aren't currently being obliterated. Thunder was often associated with divine anger, punishment, or the activity of saints. Yes, saints. Because of course medieval saints didn't just bless babies and glow faintly. Sometimes they had full-scale meteorological powers. There are recorded stories of saints calming storms, redirecting lightning, and, in one charming tale, boxing a thundercloud like it owed the money. Science? Never heard of her. But ghosts? Demons? Heavenly disapproval in cumulus form? Oh, absolutely. Now, let's say you live in a quaint little village in, say, 12th century France. Your neighbor, the one with suspicious goats and a mysterious mole on his chin, has been acting weird lately. He mutters. He owns too many cats. Then one night, a massive thunderstorm rolls through, and your roof catches fire. What do? You blame him. Obviously. Because thunder is a sign of witchcraft. Or sin. Or someone didn't tithe properly. The logic is waterproof. Your roof, sadly, is not. And if you were lucky enough to live somewhere with chronic storms, congratulations, you were considered spiritually suspect all the time. Let's talk about charms and rituals. Because medieval people didn't just sit there and take the thunder, they fought back. With, symbolic bread and Latin muttering. There were anti-storm prayers. Anti-lightning processions. Holy water was sprinkled. Bells were rung, not because people were particularly musical, but because it was believed that the sound of church bells scared off storms. The idea was that the bell's sacred chime would frighten demons hiding in the clouds. And here's the best part, bell ringers sometimes died doing this. Yep. They climbed up the tower during the thunderstorm, ringing the giant bronze bell in a lightning magnet. For safety. It's basically the medieval version of licking an outlet to please Jesus. Of course, this led to some awkward theological questions. Like, if lightning struck the church, what did that mean? Was God mad at himself? Did the bell not chime right? Did Brother Eustace forget to bless the clapper? Don't worry. The answers were usually even more confusing. Sometimes it meant a nearby, which was sabotaging the church. Sometimes it was a test of faith. And sometimes it was just Tuesday. Moving on. In Northern Europe, there was a particular belief that thunder was actually caused by Thor. Not Marvel Thor. Pre-movie Thor. Real Norse Thor. He wasn't sexy. He was terrifying. And yes, even well into the Christian Middle Ages, people still told stories of Thor's chariot causing the thunder as he rode across the clouds, flinging his hammer at frost giants and, presumably, bad crops. Christianity may have taken over, but old beliefs are like medieval mildew, hard to get rid of, and somehow always damp. You'll find these weird religious and pagan hybrids all over medieval Europe. In some regions, people believed rainbows were a divine covenant, a promise from God never to flood the world again. But if a rainbow appeared before a storm, it was a sign of punishment. So, good luck decoding the meteorological mood swings of the divine. In other places, people tied bits of cloth to trees during storms, a practice dating back to pre-Christian traditions. Or they'd carry amulets carved with biblical verses, not for comfort, but to literally repel lightning. And yes, some people tried to use relics, actual saint bones, to calm storms. So if you ever think modern people are weird for wearing crystals, just remember, someone once waved a rib fragment of Saint Bartholomew at a thundercloud. Now, let's pause. Imagine it's raining again, hard this time. You're walking to church because, obviously, you need to confess something. You're cold, wet. The mud is up to your ankles, and your shoes are, functionally, soggy medieval socks tied with string. You're praying not to be struck by lightning. And you pass a shrine, a tiny one, at the crossroads. Inside is a statue. It's got wide eyes. Someone's left it a bowl of grain. Maybe some berries. Maybe a coin. It's not Jesus. Not quite. It's a local saint. Or spirit. Or both. People still hedge their bets. Because in a world where thunder could kill you and rain could starve you, you needed everyone on your side. God, Jesus, saints, elves, the old gods, your grandmother's ghost, whoever was listening. That's the thing no one tells you about medieval people. They weren't stupid. They were desperate. And when you're desperate, you try everything. So you go to church. You pray. You light candles. You attend a special mass for weather pacification, an actual thing. Yes, the church had specific services to beg God for better weather. They read psalms. They processed with relics. They stood out in the rain because waterproof cloaks were for kings and bad poetry. And when that didn't work, people tried local rituals, like putting bread in the river, or sacrificing a chicken, or tying a frog to a post and yelling at it, which, oddly enough, was a real ritual in parts of France, possibly intended to tell the spirits of water to back off. No one actually knew how weather worked, so everything was fair game. And thunder? Thunder was personal. It wasn't just a storm. It was a message, a sign, a celestial Yelp review, with sound effects. Sometimes, entire regions would declare days of fasting to ward off bad weather, or appoint special priests to perform weather masses. Or, and this is my favorite, hire monks to stand in fields and chant at clouds. You haven't lived until you've imagined Brother Wilfred waving incense at a cumulonimbus and yelling psalms like it owes him rent money. And the funny thing is, it almost worked. Not because it changed the weather, but because it gave people hope. It's easy, in the 21st century, to laugh at these rituals, to scoff at the frog tying, the bell ringing, the anti-thunder bread waving. But in a world where one bad season meant mass starvation, thunder wasn't just scary, it was existential. And belief, even weird belief, kept people going. You roll over in your straw bed again. The thunder is distant now. The roof still leaks. Your blanket smells like goat. You close your eyes. You wonder, was that lightning because you swore yesterday? Or because your cousin kissed the wrong person in the woods? Either way, tomorrow you'll go to the church, or the shrine, or the frog post. You'll do something. Because you're medieval. And you don't just endure the rain. You try to outweed it. And now, let's take a deep breath. The storm is fading. The frogs are probably safe. Brother Wilfred is asleep in a hayloft, mumbling thunder curses in Latin. Let the rain fall. You've got amulets after all. You wake up to the gentle sound of sheep screaming, which, let me tell you, is somehow worse than thunder. One of them has wandered into the garden again. Or possibly the oven. You're not sure. Your medieval house, after all, doesn't really have a proper wall between the kitchen and the rest of your life. Just a half-burnt beam, a cloud of smoke, and a chicken who refuses to leave. It rained all night. Again. Which means the path to the village is now less of a road and more of a slippery brown death trap. Your shoes, or rather, your leather bags pretending to be shoes, have all the traction of a wet pancake. But you have to go. Because today is the day of the special procession. The one for divine intervention. Because thunder rolled over the town 3 nights in a row, and that clearly means someone here's done something deeply sinful. Was it you? Of course not. Probably not. Maybe. You did eat that extra piece of barley bread last week without sharing. Then again, last time thunder came, it turned out the butcher's apprentice had secretly married his cousin. Which, back then, was only frowned upon if they didn't get a papal dispensation first. Welcome to another day in the thunder-haunted theme park that is medieval Europe. Population, nervous peasants, increasingly suspicious clergy, and a sky full of passive-aggressive symbolism. But hey, at least it's interesting, right? As you trudge through the wet village square, dodging chickens and trying not to inhale the perfume of sewage mixed with wet wool, you see the priest already standing at the front of the crowd. He's holding a relic, possibly a splinter from the true cross, or possibly just a piece of a very convincing table. He raises it dramatically. Everyone starts to chant. This isn't unusual. Medieval Christianity, especially in Western Europe, was deeply performative. And by that, I mean every single weather event was treated like it was starring in a community theater production of the Book of Job. Storms were one of the key reasons why public processions were a thing. And these weren't just small village strolls. Sometimes they lasted for hours. Monks in long robes would carry relics, chant in Latin, and occasionally drag statues of Mary through the streets like they were on some sacred float parade. There might be incense. There might be bells. There was almost always mud. What's fascinating is that these processions were both religious and social theater. If a storm had damaged crops or floods had wiped out the fields, you could almost bet the town would react like an angry community group demanding better weather policy from the Almighty. And let's be honest, when your grain supply depends entirely on whether clouds feel like cooperating, you'll try anything. And let's talk about how personal that relationship with the sky could get. There are entire records, actual medieval manuscripts, that describe how certain villages believed they had angered specific saints. Not God. Not Jesus. No, Saint Leonard, for example, had a bone to pick with them personally. So they'd bribe him. With candles. With offerings. With, I kid you not, butter sculptures. There are chronicles from Ireland, for instance, where during droughts, entire towns would fast and donate butter to St. Bridget, hoping she'd intervene with the rain schedule. And if it rained, success. Bridget liked butter. If not, well, maybe someone in the next village was hoarding sin again. And then there were the feast days. Oh yes, feast days. Entire days dedicated to saints who were specifically believed to have weather-controlling abilities. Some regions even had weather saints, like Saint Medard in France, who was said to cry when it rained and smile when it shined. People treated his day, June 8th, like a weather forecast. If it rained on Saint Medard's day, it would rain for the next 40. Because logic. It was basically medieval Groundhog Day, but instead of a small rodent predicting spring, it was a 6th century bishop controlling the sky with the power of Catholic guilt. And don't even get me started on the weather calendars. These were almanacs, usually handwritten, where monks and farmers would record patterns, stars, storms, and omens. And while you might think these were scientific, many were deeply religious. If a storm happened after someone dreamed of a snake, divine sign. If it hailed 3 days after a woman with red hair visited your house, repent. And probably burn her, just in case. Now let's pivot slightly, because we need to address one of the weirder medieval beliefs about weather, thunderstones. Yes, thunderstones. These were objects, usually flint arrowheads or fossils, that people believed had fallen from the sky during thunderstorms. The logic went like this: the storm is a supernatural event. Thunder is a divine or demonic weapon. And these sharp little stones? Clearly missiles fired from the clouds. People would collect them, thinking they had magical protective properties. Some farmers would even bury them near their barns or under doorways to protect from further lightning strikes. Because nothing says I understand meteorology like burying a prehistoric shark tooth under your cabbage patch. Speaking of prehistoric confusion, did you know that some medieval scholars tried to explain thunder scientifically? Sort of. There were a few brave souls, especially in the later Middle Ages, who began writing about natural causes. Warm air, pressure changes, water vapor, etc. They were often politely ignored. Why believe in atmospheric physics when you could believe in sinful blacksmiths causing storms with their hammering? And yes, that was a real belief in parts of rural Germany. That thunder was the sound of evil blacksmiths working in the clouds, trying to forge storms. The solution? Throw iron tools into the fire while saying a prayer. Because obviously the best way to fight sky-forging cloud demons is with passive-aggressive metallurgy. Let's check back in with you. You've reached the church. The service has started. Everyone is praying very, very loudly. A child sneezes and gets immediately blessed. The thunder cracks overhead. The priest pauses, dramatically, of course, and then waves the relic higher. You are soaked. The rain is now horizontal. Your cloak weighs as much as a bucket of wet sand. You're trying not to shiver, because shivering might be seen as spiritual doubt. You lock eyes with a chicken who is also sheltering in the church. For a brief moment, you understand each other completely. The service ends. The thunder slows. The priest, beaming, declares that the worst is past. Everyone agrees. Because what else can they do? They go home. You go home. You wring out your cloak. You light a candle. You don't understand the weather, but at least you feel like you've done something about it. Now here's the twist. These rituals? They actually helped. Not with the weather, obviously. The clouds didn't care about butter, saints, or incense. But they helped people cope. Gave them a sense of control. A belief that they weren't powerless, even when their world was literally washing away. And in a way, that's kind of beautiful. We might laugh at the relics, the rain processions, the sky-born blacksmiths. But in a world that made no sense, where famine, death, and disease were daily realities, these beliefs offered hope. Structure. Meaning. It didn't matter if it was wrong. It mattered that it worked, emotionally. So tonight, as the thunder rolls again, you snuggle deeper into your straw bed. Your pillow smells like mildew and onions. Your roof still leaks. But you've said your prayers. The bells have been rung. The relic has been waved. The butter has been sacrificed. You've done your part. And if lightning strikes? Well, maybe St. Medard had a scheduling conflict. You wake up in the middle of the night to a flash of white-hot light and an immediate crash of thunder so loud, it sounds like the sky just kicked over the furniture. Your ceiling, and let's be generous here, it's more a suggestion of a roof than a functioning barrier, rattles ominously. A few wooden shingles creak in protest. One of them falls on your face. Congratulations. You are officially being attacked by your house. Welcome back to the medieval world, where nature is terrifying, divine, and absolutely personal. That lightning bolt? Not just a spark of electrostatic discharge. No, in your world, that was either God's rage, the devil's mischief, or possibly your neighbor's fault. You know the one who keeps eyeing your goat a little too long. But before we wade too deeply into supernatural goat gossip, let's settle into the reality of medieval lightning beliefs. Because you're going to be here for a while. The storm isn't stopping anytime soon. And honestly, neither is this chapter. So tuck yourself in. Shift the mouse-stuffed pillow under your neck. Try to ignore the smell of wet ash and regret. And let's talk about how lightning wasn't just a weather event. It was a medieval morality slap in the face. Let's start with the obvious. Everyone feared lightning. This might not seem remarkable until you remember that these people also lived with open fires, wolves, and 4 plagues a century. And yet, lightning held a special place in the, oh no, we're all going to die hierarchy. Because lightning wasn't random. At least, not to them. If a church was struck by lightning, it was a sign of deep corruption. If a barn caught fire during a storm, it was because someone inside had sinned. And if your pig exploded during a thunderstorm, which, I regret to inform you, did occasionally happen, well, you probably didn't tithe enough this month. Let's unpack that. See, in medieval cosmology, the universe was layered. You had the earthly realm. That's you, your mud, your turnips. Then above that, the sky, where angels presumably roller skated between the stars. Above that, The divine heavens. Lightning was seen as a vertical message, a celestial text message, if you will, from the upper floors of the universe. And that message usually read, "Stop sinning, you little gremlin." So naturally, the church took lightning very seriously. And when I say the church, I don't mean some cozy little congregation with polite singing and tea after service. No, I mean the church. Capital C, theologically dominant, politically terrifying, and deeply, almost erotically obsessed with weather symbolism. Which leads us to one of the strangest, most poetic, and occasionally horrifying medieval practices, bell ringing during storms. Yes, bell ringing. You're in a medieval village. A storm rolls in. Clouds darken. The air thickens with static and Old Testament energy. What do? You ring the church bells. Because, and this was a widely held belief, the sound of consecrated church bells could dispel storms. Why? Because the bells had been blessed. Some even had Latin inscriptions, holy water poured inside them, and prayers baked right into the bronze. The sound of the bell, people believed, could break apart storm clouds and frighten away lightning like some kind of divine air horn. And here's where it gets a little tragic. There are numerous historical records, especially in France and Germany, of bell ringers being killed by lightning while trying to dispel the storm. They'd climb the tower, start ringing the bell, and boom. Instant martyr. Or, depending on the theological spin, instant reminder that maybe we shouldn't try to out-SoundCloud God. By the 15th century, some towns even began engraving inscriptions inside their bells like, "Fulgura frango, I break the lightning." A beautiful sentiment. A wildly ineffective one. Now imagine you're that bell ringer. You've been woken in the night. The storm is raging. You light your little candle. You climb that slippery wooden ladder into a stone tower that's the tallest lightning rod in the entire village. All for the privilege of maybe saving the town. Or maybe getting turned into a crispy theological warning poster. And what do you get for your trouble? Maybe a few coins. A thank you from the priest. A solemn nod from the baker. And possibly a burned foot if the lightning didn't feel like missing that night. Let's talk protection. No, not that kind. This is medieval Europe. There's no latex, and herbs are used strictly for warding off evil, not contraception. I mean protection from storms. So what do you do if you can't ring a bell, or you're worried that your barn might attract lightning? Well, good news, there are plenty of homemade, regionally weird solutions for that. For instance, burying animal skulls at the four corners of your property. Why? Because animal bones absorb sin. Or absorb lightning. Or both. It really depends on which century and which wildly confused monk you're quoting. Another option? Hanging herbs or sacred items above doors. Rue, vervain, or St. John's wort were common picks. Some would even sew these into children's clothes, hoping to ward off what they called storm sickness. What is storm sickness? It was basically a fancy term for trauma, lightning-induced anxiety, or just general bad vibes. You could also draw protective signs on your walls using chalk. A common one was the cross circle, symbolizing the four corners of the earth united under God. Others included runes, stars, and, occasionally, poorly drawn saints with suspiciously long noses. And let's not forget charms. Tiny bits of carved wood, small bones, or pieces of linen with biblical verses scrawled on them. Many were worn around the neck or sewn into hats. Because when the sky wants to kill you, nothing says protection like a slightly damp cloth with Psalms 91 written in chicken blood. But the most extreme measures? You'll want to sit down for this. Unless you're already lying in bed, in which case, congrats, you're halfway to medieval survival mode. In some parts of Europe, particularly in the Alps and Bavarian forests, people held the belief that human voices could literally summon or repel storms. So if a storm was coming, someone, often an old woman, always terrifying, would be sent to the hilltops to shout spells into the wind. These weren't just mutterings. They were performances. Full volume, bellowing, cursing the clouds kind of rituals. Like Shakespearean weather rap battles. The idea was that storms had spirits. Sometimes demons, sometimes giants, sometimes just angry air elementals with bad manners. And you could negotiate with them through volume. Now, you might be wondering, did this work? Absolutely not. But that never stopped anyone. Because remember, the goal wasn't meteorological success. It was psychological control. You weren't just yelling at clouds. You were reminding yourself that you weren't helpless, that you could do something, even if that something was screaming profanity into a thunderstorm from the top of a cabbage mound. Now, let's slow things down for a second. You're back in bed. The storm has passed. The thatch roof held, barely. Your candle flickers. The room smells of damp linen, wood smoke, and something definitely dead under the floorboards, but you've stopped checking. You curl under your coarse wool blanket. You think about the day, about the bells, about the terrified goat that tried to climb into the rafters. And you breathe. Because the medieval world might be chaotic, cruel, and catastrophically bad at science, but somehow, people survived. Not because they understood the weather, but because they outlasted it. They sang through the thunder. They prayed through the lightning. They invented stories, some comforting, some terrifying, because in a world of randomness and pain, stories were their survival. So maybe tonight, as you drift off, you'll hear a distant rumble. You'll imagine a bell ringer in a faraway tower, doing their best to keep the sky from falling. And maybe, just maybe, you'll appreciate the silence a little more. You wake up choking on smoke. Not the pleasant kind. Not a cozy fireplace, mulled wine, toasted oats kind of smoke. No, this is sharp, gritty, lung-itching charcoal fog, wafting up from what was once your neighbor's barn and is now an aggressive pile of sadness and half-melted livestock. It stormed again last night. Hard. The kind of storm that rips open roofs like they're parchment and flings livestock halfway across the county. Someone claims they saw a cow fly. You believe them. You're not even surprised. This is medieval Europe. Everything is either a miracle, a curse, or just really bad farming luck. But this time, people aren't blaming God. They're blaming the woman who lives alone on the edge of the woods. The one with a limp, 2 cats, and a suspicious knowledge of herbs. The one who muttered something under her breath last week when the baker refused her credit. The one you now hear screaming. Because that's what happens next. When storms get too strong, too weird, too targeted, someone has to take the blame. And if that someone is old, female, solitary, and owns a toad, congratulations. She's officially the medieval weather scapegoat. So sit back. Get comfortable. Let the burning hay smell fade into the background. Because this chapter is about weather witches, sky demons, and why lightning was just your ancestors' way of saying, oops, we panicked. First, let's get one thing straight. In the medieval mind, bad weather had intent. Rain that destroyed your barley field? That was aimed. A freak hailstorm that flattened your chic? Personal. A drought that lasted all summer, followed by sudden floods that carried away your pigsty? Clearly, someone made a pact with the devil. Probably someone from the next village. Or worse, someone from your own village. Which brings us to the witches. Now, not all witches were weather witches. Some just specialized in things like healing, midwifery, cursing your enemy's crops, or giving your goat diarrhea through intense glaring. But when it came to storms, that was high-tier sorcery. That was elite villainy. In many parts of Europe, especially by the 14th century, people truly believed that witches could summon storms. Not metaphorically. Not in a they're a bad omen sort of way. Literally. Flying through the air. Whipping up hailstones. Riding the wind. Cackling in Latin. And here's where things get creative. According to inquisitorial manuals, you know, those charming bedtime reads full of torture advice and theological paranoia. Witches summon storms through ingredients. For example, a dead frog stuffed with nettles. Hair from a black cat burned at midnight. Human urine, boiled with thistle, the fingernail of a hangman, and, in one particularly festive recipe, bread stolen from a church altar, ground into powder, and mixed with goat bile. You're probably thinking, surely no one actually believed this. Oh, sweet summer child. Not only did people believe it, but they testified to it in court. Under very generous definitions of willingly, of course. Medieval trials weren't known for their fair treatment or consistent logic. If your barn burned down during a storm and you happened to argue with an old woman that week, congratulations. She now controls the weather and must be executed before it rains again. Entire weather-related witch trials were recorded. In Switzerland, during the late 1500s, dozens of women, and some unlucky men, were accused of causing a devastating hailstorm that ruined crops. Their confessions, extracted under gentle persuasion, i.e., being stretched like medieval spaghetti, detailed how they flew through the air on pitchforks and stirred the clouds like soup pots. And that brings us to sky-riding witches, a delicious bit of folklore where women literally rode through the air in storms, sometimes alongside demons, sometimes riding goats, and sometimes just levitating in an extremely sassy posture. This wasn't just superstition. It was doctrine. The Church, particularly in the Malleus Maleficarum, a cheerful 15th century guidebook for how to ruin a perfectly good village, described weather witches as real, dangerous, and Satan's personal meteorologists. It didn't matter if the storm had a perfectly explainable cause. It wasn't explainable enough. And if you think this paranoia stayed in the countryside, think again. There were popes, actual popes, who wrote letters about demonic storms. One even commissioned prayers specifically designed to repel weather demons. Because why blame geography when you can blame Lucifer's rain interns? But it wasn't just witches causing trouble in the sky. Let's talk storm demons. Because, yes, the medieval sky was crowded. You had saints, angels, God, witches, and now demons flapping around like poorly trained pigeons with weather control issues. The most famous? Tempestarii. No, that's not a Harry Potter house. These were the supposed storm makers, magical humans who could command weather spirits. Usually seen in German and Norse folklore, these people weren't necessarily evil. Some were considered protectors, but most were deeply feared. There are actual sermons, real, angry, overly long medieval sermons, that talk about people making deals with storm demons to destroy their neighbor's barley or ruin a wedding. And sometimes, it wasn't even the demon doing it. It was cloud ships. That's right. Cloud ships. People believed, particularly in 9th century France, that there were boats that sailed through the sky, manned by mysterious sky people, who would drop anchor and either steal crops or create weather for fun. There's even a record of one poor farmer who claimed he saw sky men descending from a cloud ship to collect dew. He was, naturally, arrested for heresy. Of course, some places had their own storm spirits. Slavic folklore had Purin, a thunder god who threw lightning like spears. Norse mythology gave us Thor, who, let's be honest, would have made an excellent weather app if you were okay with unpredictable goat-driven travel times and occasional ham-related collateral damage. In all of this, ordinary people, you, the unlucky peasant curled in your soggy bed, were left trying to survive. So what could you do? First, you protected your house. You scratched sacred symbols into your doors. You kept herbs above the windows. Some people even nailed live toads to their walls to absorb bad weather energy. Don't worry. The toads were already unhappy. You also sang. A lot. There were weather prayers, weather chants, weather lullabies. In Italy, children were sometimes walked through the streets while people shouted water songs, hoping that their innocence would convince the sky to stop throwing temper tantrums. Sometimes you even made weather dolls, little figurines dressed in tiny outfits, placed in public, meant to either summon or repel rain. And no, these weren't always cute. Some had terrifying faces, weirdly long arms, and were clearly made by people who had never seen a human child. Did it work? Absolutely not. But it felt like something. Because ultimately, everything, all of it, comes down to control. You live in a world where death is everywhere. Where your field might flood. Your sheep might explode. Your priest might blame the stars. Your neighbor might curse your onions. And you, poor, weather-beaten you, just want to make it to the next harvest. So you believe. You believe in sky witches, in thunder demons, in goat-riding storm spirits and toad-soaked protective magic. Because belief is power, even if it's imaginary. Especially if it's imaginary. And tonight, the air smells strange again. The wind is picking up. A black cat sits on your windowsill, licking its paw ominously. Someone's whispering a prayer outside. You pull your blanket tighter. Not because you're scared, but because you know the sky is listening. And tomorrow? Well, we'll talk about holy relics that stopped lightning, monks who mapped thunder, and what to do when a saint's fingerbone gets soggy. You wake up to silence. Not the peaceful kind, like birdsong drifting through dewy meadows, or the soft shuffle of a barefoot monk sweeping a cloister walkway. No, this is the dangerous kind of silence. The kind that arrives just before the sky explodes in biblical rage. The kind of silence that chickens respect. The kind that cows interpret as a divine threat. The kind that means you're about to get smited, probably by accident. You step outside. Look up. The clouds above you are thick and swollen, like overripe fruit ready to burst into divine punishment. You sigh. Again? It's always something. Famine, plague, bandits, war, and now angry sky juice. And it's only Wednesday. You're not sure if you should pray, hide, or just lie down and accept your soggy fate like a noble wet sack of barley. But then you remember something. A glimmer of hope. A tiny sliver of heavenly insurance. The finger bone of Saint Vitus, wrapped in linen and sealed inside a silver reliquary shaped like a small, judgmental foot. It's your parish's most sacred object. It's been hauled out of the church crypt every time thunder starts to roll in. It doesn't always work, but sometimes it does. Or, at least, the lightning hits someone else's roof instead of yours. Which, in the Middle Ages, basically counts as a miracle. So tonight, we're diving into the divine arms race of relics, saints, holy objects, sacred umbrellas, miracle medals, and other questionable spiritual tools people believe could block, redirect, or cancel thunderstorms. Because when you're living in a world where buildings are flammable, metal is scarce, and God is moody, you start looking for sky protection wherever you can find it. Let's begin with relics. Medieval Europe was obsessed with them. Bones, hair, teeth, fingernails, blood-stained linen, and even the occasional breast milk of the Virgin Mary. Don't ask how they stored that, if it had touched a saint, or was rumored to have touched a saint, or looked vaguely saint-adjacent. Someone had it sealed in a gold case. And those relics? They had powers. Healing power. Protection power. Crop blessing power. And yes, anti-lightning power. Some relics were known for being so potent, they could turn aside storms. Saint Donatus was one such heavy hitter. This guy was basically the medieval patron saint of sky hazard insurance. People would march his relics out into the fields during ominous weather, holding them aloft like divine lightning rods. Sometimes they'd process with candles. Sometimes with livestock. Sometimes both. You've never seen a more anxious goose than one walking in a thunder-repelling conga line. Saint Barbara was another thunder favorite. You prayed to her if you thought your chimney was about to become a lightning magnet. She was the unofficial patron saint of please don't set my rafters on fire. People hung her image over doors, carved her initials into beams, and occasionally buried tiny Saint Barbara statues under the floorboards like divine fire extinguishers. But what if your local church didn't have a relic? No problem. Enter the holy medallion industry. Medieval merchants knew an opportunity when they saw one. By the 13th century, you could buy tiny pewter charms with images of thunder-defying saints. These were not cheap, nor particularly well-made. Some of them looked like melted biscuits. Others were clearly just flattened spoonheads. But it didn't matter. If it had Saint Erasmus' face on it and you wore it while staring at the clouds, you were practically invincible. At least until the wind changed. Some monks even developed thunder prayers, meant to be recited during storms. These were long, dramatic, and usually in Latin, because nothing says I'm serious about surviving this electrical crisis like a dead language. A popular one? Deliver us, O Lord, from lightning and tempest, from plague, famine, and war, and from sudden death. Spoiler alert, God did not always RSVP. And if relics and medals weren't enough, you could always escalate to bells. Yes, bells. Church bells were believed to dispel storms. The logic went something like this. The bell sound reached heaven, reminded the angels that people were down here trying not to drown, and politely asked the clouds to knock it off. It was so widely believed that in some places, churches rang their bells at the first sign of thunder, even if that meant sending a poor, terrified bell ringer up into a tall wooden tower during an active lightning storm. You can probably imagine how well that ended. Spoiler, crispy monks were not an uncommon feature of early weather events. Eventually, secular authorities had to ban bell ringing during storms because it was killing too many bell ringers. But don't worry, that didn't stop the creativity. In some towns, they blessed the roofs. Yes, roof blessings. Entire processions of priests would march through the village, flinging holy water on thatched roofs, chanting storm-warding prayers, and sometimes literally yelling at the clouds. Picture a robeman, waving incense at the sky like it owes him money. That's how you kept your granary from turning into a lightning souffle. And then, of course, you had the pilgrims. Poor souls walking barefoot through muddy roads, trying to reach a shrine known for its thunder-blocking miracles. There were dozens of such shrines scattered across Europe, many with statues or images of saints who, at some point, had allegedly yelled at a thunderbolt and survived. One such place was the shrine of Saint Medard in France. This guy was so committed to rain protection, he once opened his mouth during a storm and allegedly swallowed a bolt of lightning. Did that actually happen? Absolutely not. Did people believe it? Of course they did. And that's why they walked for 3 weeks to his shrine with nothing but a dried fish and a goat bladder full of wine. Let's take a moment to talk about superstition-adjacent objects. Because it wasn't just relics and saints. Sometimes, the line between faith and panic-driven folk magic was about as thin as your roof that's now on fire. People placed horseshoes above their doors to ward off storms. Not because of their shape, but because iron was believed to scare off demons. It didn't. Demons found it hilarious. Crossing your cutlery on the table during a storm was said to calm the sky, presumably by confusing it. Hanging a knife over the door during lightning was supposed to cut the storm. There is no recorded instance of this ever working. There are several where someone got stabbed. In some rural villages, people even burned chicken feathers to stop hail, which mainly just made your house smell like Satan's pillowcase. Meanwhile, in the academic world, yes, even the Middle Ages had academics. Although they were mostly underpaid monks with eye infections, there were some truly bold theories about how thunder worked. One treatise claimed thunder was the sound of air bursting from a swollen cloud like an intestinal wind. So basically, sky farts. You're welcome. Another proposed that storms were caused by celestial dragons flapping their wings in frustration. Which, frankly, sounds more plausible than the frog in a bucket weather spell your neighbor's been trying. But perhaps the strangest thunder-related belief came from parts of Eastern Europe, where it was said that if you whistled during a storm, you could summon it closer. This gave rise to the saying, "Only a fool whistles at clouds." This was later updated to, "Only a fool whistles, period." And what about actual science? You mean pre-scientific guessing? Well, medieval thinkers eventually started noticing things like tall buildings get struck more often and metal objects seem to attract lightning. But instead of inventing lightning rods, they mostly just blamed God's aim. Until, of course, Benjamin Franklin came along in the 18th century with a kite, a key, and the world's most audacious death wish. But that's several hundred years away. Back in your current timeline, you're watching your neighbor walk slowly across the field, holding the shin bone of St. Clement like a divine antenna. He's whispering something under his breath. Probably a prayer. Or a complaint. Or a legal disclaimer. The clouds growl again. Your goats start panicking. And as the wind picks up, you realize you never did fix that hole in your roof. The one that's directly above your bed. You wonder, would it be sacrilegious to borrow the St. Clement shinbone just for tonight? Not steal it. Just lease it. St. Clement surely wouldn't mind. He's been dead for 8 centuries and seems pretty chill. But before you can act on that thought, the sky opens up. The rain begins. Not gently. Not romantically. But in huge, furious sheets, like the sky just knocked over a celestial beer barrel. And as the thunder rolls and your walls tremble and your goats try to hide inside your kitchen, you wrap yourself in a burlap sack and close your eyes. After all, you've got your St. Barbara medal. And the bishop's been yelling at the clouds all morning. You'll probably survive. Probably. You wake up to smoke. Not fire. Not yet. But definitely smoke. The kind of smoke that says something very old, very flammable, and very holy is in the process of becoming a charcoal briquette. You sit up in your hay mattress, which, let's be honest, smells like sadness and mildew, and you listen. There's a distant shouting, a cow bellowing in protest, and above all else, bells. But not the usual cheerful bells that say time for mass, or the bishop has survived another infection. These are panic bells. Frantic bells. Bells that sound like someone is trying to negotiate with thunder itself. You scramble to the door, open it, and there it is. Your village church, the center of your spiritual, social, and occasionally alcoholic life, is on fire. Now, let's be clear. Medieval churches caught fire a lot. These were not modern structures with lightning rods and sprinkler systems. These were timber-framed, thatch-roofed, incense-scented tinderboxes, often built on the highest hill in the area. For maximum visibility to God, and also for maximum exposure to lightning. It's almost like people back then thought, where should we put the tallest building in town and make sure it's topped with a large metal cross? Ah yes, right on this hill. Let's build it from pine and hope for the best. So let's talk about that. What happened when churches got struck by lightning? Spoiler, it was never interpreted as weather. It was always a message. The theological equivalent of God flipping a table. If your village church was hit by lightning, you had exactly 3 possible conclusions. God is angry. The saints are angry. Someone in the village committed a sin so spicy it's now your problem. Let's say your church spire catches fire and collapses into the nave. What do people do? They gather around the ruins, stare at the smoldering rubble, and immediately begin speculating. Was it the tanner? He's been doing suspicious things with animal skins. Was it old Margaret, who muttered something about the Virgin Mary's toenails last week? Or perhaps it was you, and that time you pretended to fast during Lent, but secretly ate goose behind the mill. Goose, by the way, was forbidden. And delicious. Now your guilt is real. Not because you regret it, but because God clearly knows. And so the village begins its ritual cleansing, which, in the most generous terms, means a lot of wailing, some processions, and the inevitable decision to blame the Jews. Yes, we have to talk about that. Because in medieval Europe, whenever something caught fire, or crops failed, or babies were born upside down, a minority group got blamed. And 9 times out of 10, that group was Jewish. This wasn't because of any actual evidence. It was because Christians, especially medieval ones, had an entire cultural framework built around the idea that misfortune equals sin equals scapegoat. So, when the church caught fire, people whispered about hidden heresies, about secret sins, about people not paying their tithe or speaking Latin wrong or accidentally touching a relic without washing their hands. And because religious buildings were supposed to be sacred, literal houses of God, any damage to them was seen as divine wrath. The kind you could feel. The kind that smelled like burnt himmels and roasted choir benches. Let's look at a few real examples. In 1195, the cathedral at Chartres, one of the grandest Gothic churches in France, was struck by lightning and burned down. This was seen not as a tragic accident, but a celestial opinion. The clergy quickly organized massive donations and even bigger processions. People brought relics from all over to help rebuild, like some kind of divine Kickstarter campaign. Or how about the Abbey of Saint Etienne in Caen? That beauty got struck twice in the 13th century. Once during Mass. The bishop took it personally. And honestly, fair enough. That's like being smacked mid-sermon by the sky. And then there's the really awkward one, St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, yes, that one, which had its bell tower blasted by lightning in 1481. That tower promptly collapsed into the basilica during Mass. You know how the Pope interpreted that? A gentle reminder from God that the architecture wasn't finished yet, which is a very Catholic way of saying, oops. Let's break down what exactly happens when lightning hits a medieval church. First, it strikes the tallest point. Usually the spire, which is often made of wood, topped with metal, because symbolism is more important than physics. Then the heat, which, by the way, is hotter than the surface of the sun, ignites the structure. Timber, thatch, tar, it all goes up like a divine matchstick. The fire spreads downward, through beams, pews, and priceless painted altarpieces. If there are bells, they start to ring on their own as the supports collapse. This is considered very bad. Medieval people believed bells tolling without a hand meant death was near. Once the fire spreads, the smoke becomes a theological issue. Is it a sign of purification? Or a warning? Or both? Meanwhile, terrified parishioners gather to pray and argue about whether someone needs to confess. Loudly. Publicly. While the walls burn. Of course, if you're a priest, your job is to stay calm. Unless you're the kind who runs around with a bucket yelling, "We're all going to die." In which case, congratulations, you're now a local legend. But let's say you survive the fire. The roof is gone. The nave is a swamp. The relics are missing, or melded, or were actually fake the whole time, and now everyone knows. What do you do next? You rebuild. Not because you want to. Not because it's easy. But because not rebuilding would make God even angrier. So the community gathers wood, lime, stones, and unpaid labor, usually in the form of children or very depressed peasants, and starts over. Often with fewer architectural ambitions. Some churches were rebuilt smaller, simpler, fire-resistant, which, in medieval terms, meant not entirely made of hay and hope. Sometimes the villagers took it as a sign to change everything. Maybe your new church will be dedicated to a different saint, one with better fire protection. Maybe you'll switch from St. Giles to St. Florian, the patron saint of firefighters. Yes, he was a real thing. Yes, people invoked him every time a thunderstorm rolled through like a heavenly riot. Or maybe, just maybe, you finally buy that lightning finial your local blacksmith keeps bragging about. A big metal point meant to channel the sky's fury. It costs 3 goats and your dignity. But hey, the next time a storm comes through, you're only mildly terrified instead of completely paralyzed. Let's talk about those storms again. They're back. You can hear them rolling in, even now, as you walk past the charred remains of what used to be the vestry. There's a hum in the air, that electric tang. Like the sky is holding its breath, ready to shout. And what are you holding? A bucket. Not because it'll help, but because everyone else is doing it and you don't want to be the one villager who didn't try. And just behind you, the priest is muttering Latin over a wooden crucifix while 2 altar boys frantically pour wine on a small flame. You're not sure if that's liturgy or panic. Either way, it's not working. But this time, no one's panicking. Not really. This is just life. In a world without science, lightning is never just lightning. It's a story, a message, a punishment, or, if you're feeling optimistic, a reminder that you're still alive to be terrified of it. You duck as a massive bolt strikes a tree not 20 yards away. The flash blinds you. The bang makes your bones rattle. And still, no one screams. They just make the sign of the cross and start hammering new boards onto the roof. Because God might be angry, but you still need a church, even if it keeps catching fire. You wake up and something's wrong. Not because something's loud, but because everything is quiet. Eerily, suspiciously, sinfully quiet. No birds. No insects. No clucking chickens or hissing geese or that one annoying neighbor who starts singing before sunrise because he thinks he's closer to the angels. No, the sky is still. Pale. Bleached out like an overwashed tapestry. The ground cracks beneath your feet, brittle as old bread. And your mouth? Your mouth tastes like regret. And dust. Mostly dust. You step outside, into a scene that looks less like your village and more like an overcooked sermon illustration. Brown fields. Drooping crops. A well that's become suspiciously quiet, which is always the medieval equivalent of a horror movie jump scare. Your neighbor walks past, mutters something about God turning his face, and spits into the dirt. Even the spit evaporates. This, you realize, is not just dry weather. This is a drought. And in the Middle Ages, that meant exactly one thing. Someone, probably you, did something really, really bad. See, today when it doesn't rain, you check your weather app, sigh dramatically, and maybe water your succulents. Back then, you assumed the entire natural order had been disrupted because someone looked at a nun too lustfully during Lent. No joke. In medieval Europe, droughts weren't just unfortunate. They were spiritual indictments. Literal climate commentary by an angry, omniscient being who apparently kept a very detailed sin ledger. And every time the sky refused to cry, people looked around for whose fault it was. Spoiler, it was always yours. Let's break this down. First, you have to understand that in the medieval worldview, weather was never random. Rain wasn't just precipitation. It was divine nourishment, a blessing, a metaphor, an agricultural miracle, and possibly the tears of saints who had strong opinions about your behavior. So when it didn't rain, that wasn't bad luck. That was a message, written in dust, delivered with suffering. If the drought lasted more than a few days, people would start talking. Quietly at first, then loudly, then in Latin, because that's how you know it's serious. The priest would step onto the pulpit and announce that the village was under judgment, possibly for fornication, or heresy, or someone letting their ox work on a holy feast day, or, worst of all, someone hiding cheese during Lent. Yes, drought-level sin. So before you settle into your blanket and drift into dreams of a world with indoor plumbing and mild weather, do me a favor. Tap that like button if you're still enjoying this historical descent into misery. Subscribe if you want more sleep-friendly sarcasm. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. I always love to see who else is suffering through insomnia with medieval peasants. Now, where were we? Yes. Blame. You see, droughts were deeply democratic, in the worst way. Everyone got punished, but only someone caused it. So you'd hold a meeting. A town assembly. Which is medieval code for a bunch of men arguing loudly while women tried to keep the goats from chewing the altar cloth. Eventually, a scapegoat would emerge. Sometimes literally a goat. Sacrificed to appease divine forces, even if the church technically frowned upon that sort of thing. But more often, it was a person. Maybe a widow who kept to herself. Or a mun who refused to confess. Or a foreign merchant with suspiciously shiny shoes. Or someone who said maybe the clouds are just empty and thus became a heretic. In the worst cases, it was someone accused of weather magic. Yes, that was a thing. Weather magic, or tempestarii, were people believed to summon or prevent rain. Sorcerers of the sky. Accused of either calling storms or withholding them, usually for a fee. Or because they hated barley. If your village had one bad harvest, it was misfortune. If you had two, it was witchcraft. And if you had three, you build a pyre. There are actual records, as in ink on parchment receipts from hell, where entire communities held public trials for suspected weather witches. Accusations included things like he owns a toad or she whispered to a cloud. One famous case? A 9th century bishop named Agabard of Lyon wrote a treatise titled On Hail and Thunder defending peasants against accusations of weather sorcery. Why? Because people were blaming storms on cloud ships, yes, ships that sailed the sky, and capturing supposed storm wizards who'd fallen off the sides. Agabard, bless his exhausted soul, tried to explain that this was probably not how meteorology works. He was not successful. People still believed it. Because let's face it, cloud ships are more fun than crop rotation. Let's return to your village. It hasn't rained in 46 days. The grain is dying. The riverbed looks like a cracked skull. The cows are producing dust instead of milk. Children are cranky. Old people are praying louder than usual. And your priest just announced a rogation procession. This is where things get spiritual. And sweaty. A rogation procession is a public march designed to convince heaven that you are truly, deeply sorry. Everyone, and I mean everyone, gets in line. Barefoot, if possible. Hooded, if humble. Singing hymns, carrying crosses, waving banners, and possibly dragging a relic or two for dramatic effect. You circle the fields, chant psalms, sprinkle holy water, and hope God sees you. And listens. Spoiler, he doesn't. Not right away. Because medieval weather wasn't just moody. It was theologically passive-aggressive. Rain wouldn't come until everyone confessed, repented, donated, apologized to the bishop, and stopped blaming the local Jews. Spoiler, they didn't. Let's talk theology. People genuinely believed that droughts were caused by collective sin. Not individual sin, mind you. That was for leprosy and falling off carts. Droughts required group guilt. So if one person in the village committed a mortal sin, theft, adultery, apostasy, and didn't confess, that was enough. Enough for the rain to stop. Enough for the sky to close. Enough for the saints to fold their arms and say, no soup for you. And since confession was public business, the drought became a medieval reality show. Everyone speculated. Everyone judged. And everyone waited for someone to crack under pressure and yell, fine, it was me. I ate meat on Friday and thought lustfully about my cousin's wife. Cue ghasts. Cue thunder. Cue possible redemption. But let's say that doesn't work. Let's say the processions fail. The prayers echo. The holy water dries mid-air. Then you move on to saints. Not the ones already watching. New ones. Desperate ones. You make offerings to Saint Medard, patron saint of rain. Or to Saint Swithin, whose feast day was said to predict 40 days of weather. If you were really ambitious, you might dig up a relic, arm bone, finger, holy sock, and carry it around the village until the sky flinched. Still nothing? Then you write to a bishop, or a pope, or anyone with better connections. Because at that point, you're essentially filing a divine customer service complaint. Now let's add some drama. You're low on food. The wheat's shriveled. The well's dry. People are whispering about famine. Drought was never just about thirst. It was about survival. About entire social orders breaking down because the heavens skipped a season. Families began to hoard. Markets collapsed. Salt prices skyrocketed. Bread shrank. Beer got weaker. And worst of all, the dogs disappeared. And no one wanted to ask where they went. You walk through the village square, and it's no longer the hub of gossip and goat-related chaos it used to be. Now it's quiet, empty. People stay inside. Windows shuttered. Doors barred. Eyes looking upward. Waiting for rain. Waiting for forgiveness. Waiting for the sky to notice their suffering and say, "All right, you've learned your lesson." And when it finally rains, if it rains, it's not just weather. It's grace. People weep. Children scream. Old women dance barefoot in the mud. The priest throws holy water in every direction like a deranged gardener. The whole village smells like wet wool and redemption. You, personally, promise never to sin again. At least until next Tuesday. You wake up before dawn. Because of course you do. The rooster's already crowed twice, which is medieval for you've got 6 minutes to get up or face divine wrath. Your back hurts from sleeping on a straw mattress that now feels moist. Not soaked, not dry. Just that clammy, confusing damp that makes you question every decision you've ever made, starting with being born. You sit up. Your wool blanket sticks to your skin with the texture of sadness and mildew. The wooden beams above your head drip faintly. You sigh. Welcome to another day on your pilgrimage. Yes, you're walking to somewhere holy, probably far away, and almost definitely in the rain. Because if there's one thing medieval pilgrims knew better than Latin prayers, it was being cold, wet, and spiritually confused. So let's lace up those ankle-crushing leather boots, sling on your sackcloth satchel, kiss your household relic goodbye, and get ready for approximately 6 to 14 months of soggy devotion, foot infections, and questioning everything. But first, if you've been nodding off with us under the dripping clouds of spiritual penance, take a moment. Like the video. Subscribe if you haven't already. I promise there are more damp, depressing medieval realities where this came from. And drop a comment to let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Especially if it's raining. Bonus points if your mattress is also betraying you with moisture. Okay, onward. So, pilgrimages. Today, if you want to feel spiritual, you light a candle, post a photo of your acai bowl, and tag it #blessed. In the Middle Ages, you walked 400 miles to stare at a dead man's finger bone in a church you couldn't pronounce. And you did it in the rain. Always the rain. Because that's the thing, God didn't care about your weather comfort. Especially not on pilgrimages. In fact, it was widely accepted, even expected, that suffering along the road added spiritual points to your final score. It's like penance, but wetter. And boy, was it wet. Let's talk gear. Your typical pilgrim outfit was, in short, not waterproof. You wore a scratchy wool tunic, maybe a hood if you were lucky, and a little cloak that could absorb exactly 1% of atmospheric moisture before becoming a full-body sponge. Your shoes? Leather flaps stitched together by someone who probably hadn't met a functioning soul in years. Socks? Hope. Just hope. You'd sling a satchel across your back with a bit of bread, a water skin, and a small relic, maybe a vial of holy oil that was actually bacon grease. And then you'd walk. In lines. With strangers. 4 weeks. Through forests, over hills, into rivers, and out again. And through it all, the rain. Oh, the rain. If medieval thunder was terrifying, an all-caps holy warning shot, then medieval rain was its passive-aggressive cousin. Endless, dribbling, cold. It didn't soak you out of spite. It soaked you because that's what it did. Historical records describe pilgrimages that became mud-slicked suffering parades. People drowned in fords. Carts flipped in bogs. Horses fell and refused to get up. Children cried so long they went quiet. And through it all, pilgrims trudged on. Why? Because they had to. A pilgrimage wasn't just a holy road trip. It was salvation. People went to seek healing, forgiveness, cures for their leprosy, blindness, guilt, or the vague but constant feeling that God was disappointed in them. And the more miserable the journey, the more likely your prayer would count. Let's say you're walking to Santiago de Compostela in northern Spain. It's one of the big ones, a real spiritual heavyweight destination. The road takes you through mountains, rivers, valleys, and every type of weather available in 12th century Europe, including, yes, torrential rain. You slip. You fall. Your boots fill with what you desperately hope is just rainwater. A cart splashes you with horsemuck and doesn't stop. And still you go on. Why? Because you were told, no, promised, that the shrine at the end would solve everything. Your wife's cough. Your son's missing toes. Your own recurring dreams about dancing devils. Whatever your cross to bear, it could be lightened at the bones of a dead apostle. But only if you suffered enough getting there. One monk described the road as a test of the soul through the baptism of affliction, which is Latin for bring extra socks, you idiot. And remember, there's no Airbnb. No Uber. Just roadside hostels run by monks who think silence is holy and cleanliness is a sin. You lie down on straw, shiver through the night, and listen to the rain drumming the roof like an angry god playing a war drum. Sometimes the leaks fall directly on your forehead. Just one spot. All night long. Let's talk about the psychology of wetness. Medieval wetness was a lifestyle. When it rained, which it did all the time, your clothes clung to you like damp regrets. Your toes began fermenting. Your fingernails softened. Your knees grew stiff and squeaky, like haunted door hinges. But worse than the physical discomfort? The spiritual ambiguity. Because you didn't know if the rain was A. a test of your faith. B. a punishment for sin. C. a test and a punishment. D. a sign that God just didn't like you very much. You'd ask the priest in your group. He'd nod solemnly, say, "The Lord works in mysterious ways," and then wander off to privately bless his own sandals. That's how you know it's bad. Let's shift locations. Imagine you're in England. Because of course you are. It's 1249, and your town has just collectively sinned by failing to build that second chapel your baron wanted. So now, the entire village is sent on a rain-drenched pilgrimage to Canterbury. It's supposed to take a week. It takes 3. Because every time you dry out just slightly, the clouds reload. And the worst part? No one complains. Because complaining means you doubt the process. And doubting the process means maybe you are the reason it's raining. And maybe if everyone else threw one more coin in the collection bowl, or flogged themselves one more time, or ate one fewer onion, the weather would clear. You reach a shrine. You kneel. You cry. You whisper prayers into the damp air and wonder if saints can hear things through fog. And for a brief, fleeting moment, the clouds break. Sunlight beams down like a warm apology. You feel seen, loved, forgiven. And then it rains again. But sideways this time. Let's pause here and talk boots. Medieval boots were basically foot-shaped buckets. They soaked, stayed soaked, and slowly became ecosystems. Historians have found preserved footwear from the 14th century that contain moss, as in, plant life, growing. Inside, the boots. Imagine walking 300 miles with a terrarium strapped to your foot. That's not footwear. That's a medieval science project. Pilgrims would wrap their feet in cloth, or leaves, or bits of sheep wool, anything to keep the skin from peeling off in strips. Did it work? Barely. But the blisters became holy. Now let's talk food. Rain ruined everything. Fires wouldn't start. Bread turned to mush. Cheese sweated. Wine diluted. Meat, if you had any, smelled faintly of swamp. Pilgrims often subsisted on rainwater, wet bread, and that one sketchy apple someone found in a ditch and insisted was a sign. Some pilgrims carried small pots to collect water from rain or puddles. These pots often contained more bacteria than hydration. But hey, dysentery was just part of the journey. Rain also turned roads into traps. Soft ground swallowed carts. Bridges collapsed. Flooded paths forced entire caravans to sleep in trees. Yes, there are records of pilgrims tying themselves to branches to avoid drowning in the night. That's not a pilgrimage. That's a wet, would a hostage situation. And still, they walked. And when they finally reached their destination, they bought a souvenir badge, kissed a relic, and then, because this is the Middle Ages, turned right around and walked home. In the rain. with slightly more foot fungus and slightly less hope. So why did they do it? Why keep going? Because in a world without science, infrastructure, or dry socks, faith was the only umbrella you had. And sure, maybe the rain was cruel. But so was everything else. And if walking through storm after storm meant maybe, you'd save your soul, you walked. Even if your boots never dried. You wake up. Again. Because in the Middle Ages, sleep isn't rest. It's an intermittent medieval nightmare where your blanket smells like goat and your dreams feature plague-ridden squirrels reciting psalms. And now, just as you begin to drift off into the one peaceful moment you've had in days, thunder. It cracks across the sky like God just dropped his holy pots and pans. The ground shakes. You sit up so fast you almost snap your neck. Rain pelts the wooden roof above you, or what's left of it after last week's storm. You can hear it, a dull, angry drumroll of divine disapproval. There's only one thing to do. Panic? No. You go get a monk. Because in your soggy, superstition-soaked world, monks are the storm whisperers. That's right. You're about to watch a mun in a rope belt yell Latin at a cloud. Because science is 400 years away, and prayer is your last and only defense against thunder that sounds like it's trying to rip a hole in the sky and personally come down to slap you. So, let's talk about it. The weather. But not what it was. What medieval people thought it was. Because, in the 13th century, rain didn't just happen. It didn't drift in from a warm front or build up from oceanic pressure systems. Oh no. It came from God. Or demons. Or angels with performance anxiety. And sometimes, it was all free. Now, grab a cup of rainwater, sit near your mostly decomposed firewood, and remember to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this slow descent into medieval meteorological madness. Also, tell me in the comments what time it is where you're watching this and whether it's storming. Or just spiritually damp. Either one works. Right. So, what did monks do when storms hit? Let's begin with the obvious. Pray. Loudly. While holding relics. Sometimes while ringing bells. And occasionally, while waving dried chicken bones at the sky. I'm not kidding. Monasteries across Europe kept collections of saintly relics, teeth, bones, fingernails, entire heads, and during violent storms, these relics were brought out like holy lightning rods. The idea was simple: God loves saints. God hates storms. Ergo, wave a saint's elbow at the clouds, and maybe he'll stop being dramatic. You'd think this would just be a quiet indoor ceremony, but no. It was public and theatrical. When a storm rolled in, monks would file out in procession, dressed in heavy robes, holding candles, chanting psalms, acolytes trailing behind, looking mildly terrified. Sometimes a relic would be hoisted up on a platform or carried on a pole like a very morbid parade balloon. They'd walk around the fields or the village, praying, ringing bells, burning incense, shouting Latin at the sky like it owed the money. And to the average medieval peasant, this wasn't just comforting. It was life-saving. Because a bad storm wasn't just loud. It was existentially terrifying. It could flatten your crops, destroy your home, kill your cow, set your barn on fire. Because yes, lightning fires were a real and constant threat. One spark, and suddenly your haystack of regrets goes up in smoke and God's wrath. So when the monks come out, you kneel, you watch, you pray, and sometimes you join. That's when things get weird. Because in some areas, the local villagers would participate in storm rituals that honestly sound less like religious rites and more like summoning circles. There are records from 14th century France describing peasants forming human chains, walking barefoot in circles around the church, and singing until their voices gave out, all while the storm raged overhead. Others would beat the earth with sticks, throw ashes into the wind, or toss coins into puddles in hopes of appeasing the sky. But the best, the absolute best, was the weather mass. Yes, there were special masses for bad weather. Entire liturgies focused on saying, essentially, "Dear God, could you not today?" Monks would chant specific psalms meant to calm the heavens. Sometimes they'd read from the Book of Job, the part where God lectures humanity with a storm cloud, as if to say, "Hey, we get it. You're powerful. Now please stop flooding the cabbage field." Let's talk about relics again. Because nothing says weather control like the dismembered kneecap of a minor saint. One particularly dramatic example comes from a monastery in Belgium, where the monks believed they could stop hailstorms by physically shaking a relic over the field. They'd march out during a storm, grab the skull of St. Hubert, and hold it up like a medieval weather remote, whispering, "Hubert, do your thing." Did it work? Who knows? Sometimes the storm stopped. Sometimes it didn't. But either way, the ritual gave people hope. And in the Middle Ages, hope was 90% of your weather forecast. Now, you might be wondering, did they ever blame the wrong thing? Oh, yes. If prayers failed and the storm kept going, well then clearly it wasn't just God being mysterious. No, it was probably witches. Or sin. Or both. You see, medieval people loved it. So if your village had been hit by one too many hailstorms this year and your crops were molding in the fields, there was a very real chance that a woman with too many cats or an unpopular herbalist might suddenly be accused of weather sorcery. That's right. Witchcraft wasn't just about flying and curses. It was about storms. There are entire 15th century legal documents detailing confessions where accused witches claimed they stirred cauldrons to summon clouds or used special herbs to birth thunder. One famous account from Switzerland describes a woman calling the clouds with goat hair and bitter words, which is possibly the most metal thing anyone's ever said under torture. And sometimes, these women were burned. Not because they did anything, but because the rain wouldn't stop. Now back to the monks. Because, bless their sandal-clad feet, they were still trying. Some monasteries developed elaborate rituals involving the elevation of sacred texts. During especially nasty storms, the Bible itself would be hoisted above the monastery roof, as if to remind God what he'd written and gently ask him to calm down. Other times, entire choirs would sing hymns for hours, sometimes days, as rain poured over the abbey. Imagine the choir boys, soaked, shivering, voices cracking, still mumbling the 127th repetition of Veni Sancte Spiritus. That's not worship. That's a Gregorian hostage situation. But here's the best part. Despite all the screaming, relic shaking, and holy smoke tossing, sometimes the storm didn't stop. And the monks, to their credit, would just shrug and say, "It must be the sins of the laity." That's you. You are why the storm didn't stop. You ate meat on a Wednesday. You looked at a nun wrong. You skipped the part of the sermon with the threats in it. And now, God is wetting your entire life out of spite. Let's end on this note. To us, thunder is just physics. Lightning is a beautiful, deadly phenomenon. Rain is water falling because of pressure and temperature. You have umbrellas, raincoats, rubber boots, weather apps. But in the Middle Ages, weather was personal. It was God speaking. It was demons lashing out. It was saints weeping. Or the sky remembering something terrible you did in 1312. When the thunder cracked, you listened. When the rain came, you repented. And when the monks walked out in the storm, barefoot, muttering prayers, holding up a saint's left thigh bone and begging for mercy, you watched in awe. Because in a world with no explanation, faith filled the silence between the lightning bolts. Even if the only thing drier than your sense of reason was your socks. Just kidding. Your socks are never dry. Not in this life. You're wet again. Surprise. It's day 6 of uninterrupted rain. The sky is one giant medieval waterbed, sloshing and leaking on your life with all the subtlety of an incontinent archangel. The thatched roof above you is leaking in 12 distinct places. You've named the drips. The big one near your foot is Gregory. You can't dry your clothes because firewood is a luxury and everything you own is already damp enough to qualify as a bog. Your boots squelch like they're threatening to unionize, your blanket smells like soggy cheese, and every breath you take has the faint tang of mildew and despair. At this point, you don't want the rain to stop. You want to get revenge. And so, naturally, being a reasonable, devout, and increasingly moldy 14th century villager, you decide to sue the weather. That's right. Welcome to one of the strangest chapters of medieval logic, where clouds could be summoned to court, excommunicated, tried, and punished. Because when God wouldn't fix it and the monks couldn't Latin scream the sky into submission, there was only one thing left to do. Treat it like a legal matter. Because clearly, the rain is breaking some kind of law. Let's begin in France, naturally, where all of history's weirdest stories either start or end. In several towns across 13th to 16th century France, it was not only considered normal to take natural disasters to court, it was expected. You wake up one morning to find your entire barley field under 3 feet of demonic soup. You know it wasn't God, because the parish priest insists he's been on his best behavior and hasn't eaten salted pork in over a month. The monks already tried waving the tibia of St. Peter at the sky, and that failed spectacularly. So clearly, this isn't a divine test. It's a crime. The storm, the literal meteorological phenomenon, has wronged you. So, what do? You write up a legal complaint. No, not joking. Actual, formal, parchment-documented, wax-sealed lawsuits filed against storms. And they were weirdly detailed. In one 15th century case, a group of villagers accused a storm cloud of malicious interference with agriculture, specifically harming peas, spoiling cabbages, and causing emotional distress to livestock. I promise you, this is real. They marched down to the village notary, dictated the complaint, and demanded justice. Now, because you can't exactly put a rainstorm in chains, although they definitely tried symbolic ones, the court would instead call upon the local priest-lawyer combo to handle it. Yes. In some regions, priests were legally empowered to act as litigators against nature. This meant issuing a summons to the cloud. Again, not kidding. These summonses were typically read aloud by clerics in the fields, often under umbrellas, if they were feeling particularly hypocritical. The priest would stand in the middle of a ruined vineyard, hold up a crucifix or a legal scroll, and order the cloud to appear. Or else. And by or else, we mean excommunication. Yes. The church, in all its thunder-soaked glory, could and did excommunicate weather. That's when things really got unhinged. Because if the cloud refused to appear, which, spoiler alert, it always did, then the priest would declare a full ecclesiastical trial in absentia. In absentia means while the defendant isn't there. Which makes sense, because again, you're suing condensed vapor. Now you're in the courtroom. Which, to be fair, is a wooden shack with one window and a goat in the back that everyone pretends isn't a problem. The judge is there. The priest is there. The bailiff is asleep. You, the peasant plaintiff, are there with your ruined turnips in a bucket, ready to make your case. And now, the trial begins. What follows is the most surreal performance in legal history. Witnesses are called. They swear oaths. Someone brings in a broken fence post as evidence. A widow sobs about her rotting onions. The goat farts. The judge takes notes. And then, the verdict. The cloud is guilty. Sentence? Banishment. That's right. The priest walks back to the field, stands in the mud, and reads a ritual that literally casts the cloud out of the area. It is now forbidden to rain here, under threat of divine punishment. Does this work? Sometimes. Because eventually, it stops raining. And you, the villager, are thrilled. Not because you believe the trial did anything, but because now you have someone to blame. You didn't lose your crops to chance. You lost them to malicious weather. You didn't suffer because the universe is indifferent and chaotic. You suffered because someone, something, did this on purpose. And in that blame, there is comfort. Now, it wasn't always the clouds on trial. Sometimes it was animals. We've talked before about pigs getting sued for murder, and that's a whole fever dream we'll get to later. But when it came to natural phenomena, medieval people really didn't hold back. Wind was sued. Yes, the wind. There's a record from 1427 where villagers attempted to summon a malevolent northern wind to appear in court. The bailiff stood on a hill and yelled into the breeze for 6 hours before giving up and calling it an uncooperative defendant. Hailstorms were treated like violent gangs. Multiple hail clouds might be tried as a group, with one designated as the ringleader. That cloud would receive the harshest excommunication, usually involving the public burning of incense, Latin recitations, and occasionally tossing holy water directly at the sky like some kind of celestial water fight. You know what's truly absurd? They had lawyers. That's right. In some more sophisticated weather trials, especially in areas of Switzerland and northern Italy, someone would actually volunteer to represent the clouds. This person, known as a defenso, would argue that the storm was a misunderstood agent of God, perhaps wrongly accused, and that the villagers' own sins had probably brought the disaster upon themselves. This was less about protecting the clouds' rights and more about theological insurance. Because if you wrongly blamed the weather and it turned out to be divinely ordained, you were basically poking God with a very sarcastic stick. Now let's talk punishments. You can't throw rain in a dungeon. So instead, punishments were symbolic, but elaborate. In one case, a cursed hail cloud was sentenced to exile, and a formal ceremony was held where it was symbolically escorted out of town using bells, smoke, and men in pointy hats chanting expulsion rites. It was like a very confused exorcism, but wetter. In extreme cases, effigies of the clouds were made. Yes, papier-mâché clouds. They were beaten with sticks, burned in public squares, or hung from church steeples as a warning to future storms. Medieval people were nothing if not committed to the bit. Of course, behind all this absurdity, there was a deep, aching truth. People were powerless. No insurance. No meteorologists. No flood warnings. No FEMA. Just crops, faith, and the fragile belief that someone, somewhere, could be held accountable. So they created stories, and laws, and trials. Not because they believed the clouds would show up in court wearing tiny powdered wigs, though what a scene that would be, but because they needed a way to cope, to scream into the storm, and believe, for just a moment, that the sky was listening. So next time it rains and you feel mildly inconvenienced, remember, you are not the first to curse the clouds. But you might be the first to not put one on trial.